remember the coming collapse of the Russian economy?
Tonight, Russia is feeling the shock of Western sanctions.
They will hit the Russian economy hard.
Waging economic war on Russia on a scale that would have been unimaginable just a year ago.
Well, so far it hasn't turned out as many had imagined. The ruble is down, but it appears to be generally stable. GDP is back to its pre-war levels. And just this week, inflation, the latest concern, it also appears to be stabilizing. Russia is now transforming into a wartime economy. But how? And what does that mean for ordinary Russians? First, what is a wartime economy? Nations at wars have higher needs for military material, from boots and backpacks to tanks and ammunition. So they reorganize their economies to prioritize that production at home, creating jobs and boosting economic activity in the process. Overall production, measured in gross domestic product, or GDP, rises. And we should mention that war is often tied to inflation, higher prices. With resources and manpower thrown into the war effort, they become scarcer back home. Governments at war also spend more, a lot more. And all of this is happening in Russia right now. The country is pouring its money and resources into the war effort to produce more of what it needs on the battlefield. And GDP is rising. The IMF forecasts it to grow by more than 2.5% in 2024, more than double the roughly 1% growth it predicted last fall. For comparison, the IMF says the US economy should grow by just over 2% this year, while the euro area will be just shy of 1%. In other words, Russia's war spending is becoming the dominant feature of its economy. So why haven't sanctions been able to cripple the war economy? Well, let's take a look at them first. Here's how U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen recently described the purpose of sanctions against Russia and President Putin.
We've had two objectives from the outset. One is to deprive Russia of revenue, as you noted, and the second is to deny him access to the equipment that he needs.
Sanctions did several big things. They cut off hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Russian reserves held by overseas banks. They also targeted the oil revenues on which Russia has become so dependent. Both of those are aimed at that revenue aspect of what Yellen just said. But Western nations also cut Russia off from the global payments clearing system, SWIFT. And they took steps to curb trading with Russia and stop the export of certain sensitive goods made in their countries. For Russia's transformation into a wartime economy to succeed, those are the measures that Moscow essentially had to solve. First, there's not much Putin can do about those frozen Russian reserves. Experts have put the number at close to $300 billion, and that sum appears to be outside of Moscow's control. But Putin has had more success when it comes to the other big hit to the country's war chest, that Western cap on oil prices. That plan attempts to put a tight lid on Putin's oil money, which traditionally funds a significant portion of his country's budget, while also keeping enough oil on world markets. It limited the price to $60 a barrel, lower than market prices at the time, for any ships insured by Western companies. A significant portion of international shippers do rely on insurers in those countries. Now, the cap hit Putin's finances hard for a while. Just a year ago, Moscow faced a sizable budget hole due to that missing money, and then it struck back. Moscow has since put together its own so-called shadow fleet of tanker ships, many of which had actually been headed to the scrap heap. They didn't fall under the letters of the new sanction, and it stepped up sales of oil to countries that hadn't imposed sanctions, primarily India and China. It's worth mentioning that the EU and its allies haven't completely stopped buying Russian fossil fuels. Due to various loopholes and opt-outs, the EU is still a major purchaser of Russian gas, even if the overall quantity is just a small fraction of what it was 3 years ago. So while Moscow's overall fossil fuel exports have fallen from pre-war times, its efforts to beat oil sanctions appear to have stopped the worst of the slide. That's helped put the Russian economy on somewhat firmer ground. But something similar is happening with general trade. With ties to the West broken, Russia has turned increasingly to other countries, especially India and China. Russia's central bank claims the value of last year's imports rose to 2021 levels after falling the year the war began, primarily due to new suppliers in other regions. But to keep its own factories going in this wartime economy, Moscow still had to get past Western export bans. In particular, the West's refusal to sell things like machine tools and semiconductor chips to Russia. These are known as dual-use goods. They're not explicitly weapons, but they have an important role in creating and maintaining weapon systems and military material used in Ukraine. Among others, the US, EU, and UK have put export controls on many of those items, meaning they won't trade them with Russia, and they prohibit their re-export through third nations. But for Moscow to ramp up its own production of war material, it needs those components. And over the past 2 years, it's gotten better at finding them. Independent researchers have detailed the trade flows through China and Turkey in particular. The US and EU have also pointed to the UAE, Syria, and Armenia. European businesses are also trading more heavily with traditional Russian partners, like Kyrgyzstan, in volumes that experts say can only point to re-export into Russia. All of this has an impact on the battlefield. But what does it have to do with the Russian economy? Let's take one example of an export-controlled material: CNC machine tools. That essentially stands for Computer Numerical Controlled Machine Tools, and it means precision computer-guided tooling for metalworking, woodworking, even plastics manufacturing. These tools are important for building and repairing everything from aircraft and missile components, and even parts for drones. And their precision generally can't be replicated by humans. Russia is heavily dependent on imports for CNC machine tools and their components, primarily from the European Union in the past years, and in particular, Germany. And its domestic industry can't make up that difference. So that's where third country exporters come in. Russian imports of CNC machine tools from Turkey jumped after the war began in 2022. From one shipment roughly every couple of months between 2019 and 2022 to one a day in June 2023. Now that's according to research by an American firm called C4ADS. It follows trade records to draw a bigger picture. In other words, EU-produced tools like metal cutting machines and vertical milling machines were suddenly entering and exiting Turkey in much higher numbers, and records strongly suggest they were ending up in Russia. Again, that's because for Russia's own war-driven production lines to continue, the production lines that are pushing up overall economic activity in the country, it has to have components that are otherwise off limits, which is why getting around sanctions has become so central to this economy, and why those third countries, like Turkey, the UAE, and China, have increasingly become the focus of the Western sanctioning countries. But Turkey is a NATO ally. It's vowed to do more against businesses trading with Russia. The UAE also says it's trying to curb that dual-use trade flow. China is another story. It's famously vowed a no-limits relationship with Russia, though it's been wary of sanctions. Moscow has become increasingly dependent on Beijing. Trade between the two has grown more than 90% from the beginning of the war to last December. But Russia's ability to get around some Western sanctions raises another question. How is it managing inflation? As I mentioned earlier, economies at war typically battle higher prices. Labor is scarcer because more people are away fighting. Hundreds of thousands of Russian casualties will never return to the workforce. More resources are pushed toward the war effort, making them harder to come by across the economy. The government is spending heavily to produce, and that money has to come from somewhere. Indeed, inflation has been a bugaboo for Moscow, and a downright problem for average Russians. As Moscow has spent on the war, prices have risen, climbing steadily across much of 2023. Russia's central bank has raised interest rates at a torrid pace in response, 5 times in 2023 alone, and it's doubled its key rate within a matter of months. The country also reinstituted currency controls that it introduced earlier in the war, essentially forcing exporters to convert foreign currencies to rubles and then preventing them from selling them. That helps prop up the local currency. Wednesday's new inflation figures add to the narrative that inflation is indeed stabilizing. The rise in the consumer price index for February was, as expected, much tamer than it was in 2023. So what does all of this mean for average Russians? GDP is rising, inflation seems to be easing, wages are even up. All seemingly positive things. First of all, there's no promise that inflation is in check, especially as the war continues. And there are some troubling long-term trends, like falling living standards, diminished trade, and the departure of talent. And there's the broader problem. An economy that's become single-minded. Investment and labor are now being marshaled at massive scale for one purpose: the war with Ukraine. And the capital being used, it could be applied to other sectors and purposes to build wealth for a more diversified economy, say by encouraging research, small businesses, building schools and hospitals. Instead, it's being used for bombs and artillery. Economies geared toward war also elevate the role of the state as the center of the country's business and trade. Here's what the director of the IMF had to say about Russia's recent shift.
If you look at Russia today, production goes up, military consumption goes down, and that's pretty much what the Soviet Union used to look like.
Now keep in mind, Kristalina Georgieva is from Bulgaria. That's a former Soviet satellite. She believes the Russian economy is still in for tough times. Bright people are leaving, and cutting-edge technology is getting harder to come by, meaning Russia is in a way gambling away its future. And this story isn't over yet. Western countries say they're not done. They aim to further undermine Russia's war finances and make sanctions even tighter, based on what they've learned so far. That means clamping down on third-party exporters to Russia and working harder to stop Russia's shadow fleets, for example by putting pressure on ports and coast guards around the world where many of these companies are operating essentially in gray areas. And through it all, we'll continue watching the Russian economy and how it's changing, for better or for worse. Thanks for watching.